On a sunny September morning, the elderly brick house at the end of Oak Street welcomed its newest visitor. Rose, a caregiver with kind eyes and gentle hands, stood at the doorstep, her heart beating a little faster than usual. She'd been caring for people for 15 years, but each new patient still gave her those first-day butterflies. The door opened slowly, and Mrs. Chen, the patient's daughter, gave Rose a quick look from head to toe. Rose was used to these looks, the slight hesitation, the unspoken questions in people's eyes when they saw a black caregiver. She just smiled warmly, the way her grandmother had taught her. "Kill them with kindness," her grandmother always said, "and let your work speak for itself." Inside, she found her new patient, Mrs. Wilson, a former school principal who'd lost movement from her neck down after a terrible car crash 6 months ago. The room smelled of lavender air freshener and hospital-grade cleaners. Mrs. Wilson lay in a specialized bed, her silver hair neatly combed, her eyes sharp and alert despite her motionless body. "Good morning, Mrs. Wilson," Rose said softly, placing her bag down. "I hear you used to run Franklin High School." "My cousin went there. Always said it was the best school in the district." Mrs. Wilson's eyes lit up a bit, though she couldn't speak or move. The first hour was awkward, as first meetings usually are. Mrs. Chen hovered nearby, watching Rose's every move like a hawk. How she checked the feeding tube. How she gently moisturized Mrs. Wilson's skin to prevent bed sores. How she spoke softly but clearly, explaining everything she was doing. "Mom's very particular about her routine," Mrs. Chen said, her voice tight with worry. "The last caregiver, well, it didn't work out." Rose nodded understanding. She'd heard this before, seen this worry before. Parents are precious, and trust takes time to build. As Rose worked, she hummed quietly. An old gospel tune her mother used to sing while cooking Sunday dinner. She noticed Mrs. Wilson's eyes following her, curious and maybe a little surprised. When Rose needed to turn Mrs. Wilson to prevent bed sores, she was extra gentle, talking through each movement. "We're going to turn to your right side now, Mrs. Wilson. Nice and slow, just like a dance." By lunchtime, something had shifted. Mrs. Wilson had developed a way of blinking once for yes and twice for no, and Rose picked it up quickly. They worked out a system for Mrs. Wilson to choose what she wanted to watch on TV, what position felt most comfortable, even how she liked her hair brushed. The real breakthrough came when Rose noticed a small detail everyone else had missed. When she was adjusting Mrs. Wilson's pillows, she spotted an old photograph on the bedside table. It showed a younger Mrs. Wilson standing in front of her school, surrounded by students of all backgrounds, her smile radiant and proud. "You were ahead of your time, weren't you?" Rose said softly, picking up the photo to show Mrs. Wilson. Leading a mixed school back then couldn't have been easy. Mrs. Wilson's eyes welled up with tears, and she blinked once. Yes. That moment created a tiny crack in the wall between them. Rose could feel Mrs. Chen watching from the doorway, her stance softening just a bit. As the afternoon sun filtered through the curtains, Rose told Mrs. Wilson about her own dreams of opening a care center someday, where everyone would be welcomed and treated with dignity, no matter their background. When evening came and Rose packed up to leave, Mrs. Wilson blinked rapidly, their new signal for wait. Rose paused, and Mrs. Wilson's eyes moved to the notepad by her bed. Through their newly developed eye signals, Mrs. Wilson asked Rose to write down when she'd be back tomorrow. "Same time tomorrow," Rose wrote in clear letters, holding it up for Mrs. Wilson to see. "We'll make it a good day." As she left, Rose could have sworn she saw the tiniest smile in Mrs. Wilson's eyes. Sometimes, she thought, the biggest journeys start with the smallest steps. The first 6 months passed like seasons changing, each day bringing small victories and new understanding. Rose learned that caring for Mrs. Wilson wasn't just about medical routines. It was about bringing life back into a room that had grown too quiet. At first, Some family members would watch from the doorway whenever Rose changed Mrs. Wilson's position or gave her medicine. They'd ask the same questions over and over, their worry barely hidden behind polite smiles. But Rose kept doing what she did best, providing care with gentle hands and a warm heart. "You know what?" Rose said one morning while preparing Mrs. Wilson's breakfast. "My grandmother always said patience is like planting a garden. You can't rush the flowers to bloom." Mrs. Wilson blinked once, their special signal for yes, and her eyes crinkled at the corners in what Rose now recognized as her way of smiling. The breakthrough came during one particularly challenging morning. Mrs. Wilson was having muscle spasms, worse than usual. Instead of calling for help, Rose remembered an old technique she'd learned from a physical therapist. She started humming softly, using gentle touch and slow movements to help ease the tension. Within minutes, Mrs. Wilson's face relaxed and her breathing steadied. That same afternoon, Mrs. Chen walked in just as Rose was finishing up a shoulder massage. She stopped in the doorway, watching silently. For the first time, she saw her mother truly comfortable, peaceful even. "How did you learn to do that?" she asked, her voice softer than usual. "Sometimes our hands know things our heads don't," Rose replied, smoothing Mrs. Wilson's blanket. "Every person is different, but the body tells you what it needs if you listen carefully enough." Little by little, the family's guard began to drop. They started asking Rose about her life, her family, her journey into caregiving. When Rose mentioned she was taking night classes to further her medical education, Mrs. Chen surprised everyone by offering to adjust the schedule to accommodate Rose's studies. During their long days together, Rose created new ways to help Mrs. Wilson communicate. They developed a system using eye movements, up for pain, down for comfort, left for cold, right for warm. Soon, they barely needed words at all. Rose could tell by the slightest change in Mrs. Wilson's expression if she was uncomfortable or needed something. One rainy afternoon, while Rose was organizing Mrs. Wilson's medical supplies, she found an old photo album. With Mrs. Wilson's permission, one blink for yes, she started flipping through it. There were pictures of Mrs. Wilson in her teaching days, standing proud in front of her classroom, surrounded by children from all walks of life. "You were building bridges long before anyone else, weren't you?" Rose said softly. Mrs. Wilson's eyes filled with tears, but they weren't sad tears. They were the kind that come when someone finally sees the truth of who you are. The most touching moment came when Mrs. Wilson's grandchildren visited. Instead of their usual hesitation around Rose, they ran straight to her, eager to show their grandmother the drawings they'd made. Rose helped them hold the pictures where Mrs. Wilson could see them, explaining how their grandmother could communicate with her eyes. "See how Grandma blinks once? That means she loves your drawing," Rose explained to the youngest child. The little girl's face lit up with understanding, and she spent the next hour making more pictures, watching eagerly for her grandmother's blinks of approval. By the end of those 6 months, something beautiful had grown in that quiet house on Oak Street. It wasn't just about a caregiver and her patient anymore. It was about two women from different worlds finding common ground in the language of compassion and understanding. As Rose drove home one evening, she thought about how Mrs. Wilson had taught her just as much as she'd helped Mrs. Wilson. Sometimes, the best healing happens in the quiet moments, in the unspoken understanding between two people who choose to see past their differences to the humanity they share. The real challenges began to show themselves in the smallest moments, like when the neighbor from across the street would peek through her curtains every time Rose arrived for her shift, or when visitors would speak to Mrs. Wilson as if Rose wasn't in the room at all. One morning, while Rose was helping Mrs. Wilson with her morning routine, a family friend stopped by. The woman walked in, took one look at Rose, and clutched her purse a little tighter. "Oh," she said to Mrs. Wilson, "I didn't realize you had help here today." The way she said help made it sound like something else entirely. But Rose had learned long ago that the best response to prejudice was excellence. She continued her work with the same gentle care she always showed, speaking softly to Mrs. Wilson as she adjusted her pillows and checked her vital signs. Mrs. Wilson's eyes met Rose's, filled with a mixture of apology and understanding. During lunch, another visitor, an old colleague of Mrs. Wilson's, watched Rose like a hawk as she carefully helped with the feeding tube. "Are you sure she knows what she's doing?" the woman whispered to Mrs. Chen, not quite quietly enough. Mrs. Wilson's eyes flashed with anger, a rare show of emotion from the usually composed former principal. To everyone's surprise, it was Mrs. Chen who spoke up. "Rose has been caring for my mother for months now," she said firmly. "She's the best caregiver we've had." The visitor's mouth snapped shut, and Rose felt a warm glow of appreciation for the family's growing support. The long days brought their own kind of poetry. Rose would tell Mrs. Wilson about her night classes while giving her a sponge bath, sharing stories about her dream of opening a care facility someday. Mrs. Wilson would blink her responses, once for encouragement, twice when she thought Rose was being too modest about her abilities. One particularly memorable afternoon, Rose was playing soft music and reading aloud from Mrs. Wilson's favorite book when the mailman delivered a package. He looked startled to see Rose there, then asked if the lady of the house was available. Before Rose could respond, Mrs. Wilson made a small sound, something she rarely did. Her eyes were fierce with protective anger. "I am the caregiver," Rose said calmly, standing a little straighter. "I can sign for the package." After he left, she turned to Mrs. Wilson with a gentle smile. "You know, my grandmother always said that some people need time to learn to see with their hearts instead of their eyes." The most touching moments came during the quiet times, when it was just the two of them. Rose would brush Mrs. Wilson's silver hair, telling her about her younger sister's college graduation or her nephew's first steps. Mrs. Wilson couldn't speak, but her eyes spoke volumes, sparkling with interest, softening with sympathy, shining with pride at Rose's accomplishments. Sometimes, when Rose would arrive in the morning, she'd find little notes from Mrs. Chen. "Mom slept well," or "Thank you for yesterday." These simple messages meant more than grand gestures ever could. They were proof that walls could come down, one brick at a time. Even the neighbors slowly began to change. The curtain peeker across the street eventually started waving hello. The suspicious looks turned into cautious smiles. Some even began to ask Rose for advice about caring for their own elderly parents. One day, while Rose was organizing Mrs. Wilson's medications, she overheard Mrs. Chen on the phone with a friend. "We're so lucky to have Rose," she was saying. "She doesn't just care for Mom. She cares about Mom. There's a big difference." That evening, as Rose was preparing to leave, Mrs. Wilson blinked out a message they'd worked out together. "Your family now." Those three simple words, spelled out through their special communication system, meant everything. They were proof that love and respect could grow in the most unlikely places, between the most unlikely people. As Rose drove home that night, she thought about how every small slight, every suspicious glance, every hurdle she'd faced had been worth it. Because sometimes the greatest victories aren't loud or dramatic. They're in the quiet moments when hearts change and understanding grows, one day at a time. 2 years into their journey together, something beautiful began to unfold in the quiet moments between Rose and Mrs. Wilson. It was more than just a caregiver and patient relationship. It had grown into a dance of understanding where words weren't always needed. Every morning, Rose would arrive just as the sun was painting the sky pink. She learned that Mrs. Wilson liked to start her day hearing about the little things. The cardinal that built a nest in Rose's backyard, the flowers blooming in the garden, or the smell of spring in the air. These simple stories brought the outside world into Mrs. Wilson's room, making it feel less like a medical space and more like a home. "You won't believe what my little nephew did yesterday," Rose would say while getting Mrs. Wilson ready for the day. She'd tell stories about her family's Sunday dinners, about her mother's famous sweet potato pie, about the wisdom her grandmother passed down through cooking lessons. Mrs. Wilson's eyes would light up, her blinks becoming more animated as she responded in their special language. One particularly memorable morning, Rose noticed Mrs. Wilson seemed down. Instead of their usual routine, Rose pulled out an old photo album she'd spotted on the bookshelf. Together, they flipped through pages of Mrs. Wilson's life, her teaching days, family picnics, and holiday celebrations. Through their Blink communication system, Mrs. Wilson shared stories about each photo. Rose learned about the time Mrs. Wilson took her entire class on a camping trip, despite never having camped before herself. "You were quite the adventurer, weren't you?" Rose smiled, watching Mrs. Wilson's eyes sparkle with memories. One blink, yes, that sparkle was worth more than any spoken word. Their bond grew stronger through the small moments. Rose noticed that Mrs. Wilson's breathing would calm whenever she hummed old gospel songs, so she started singing softly while doing their morning routine. Soon, Mrs. Wilson would move her eyes in a certain way when she wanted Rose to sing her favorite tune. During lunch breaks, Rose would tell Mrs. Wilson about her night classes and her dreams. "I want to create a place where everyone feels valued," she'd say, while carefully adjusting Mrs. Wilson's feeding tube. "A care center where nobody feels alone." Mrs. Wilson would blink rapidly, their signal for excitement and approval. The family noticed the change too. Mrs. Chen would often find them in what looked like deep conversation, though only one person could speak. "I don't know how you do it," she said to Rose one day, "but Mom seems happier than she's been since the accident." Rose shared stories about her own struggles and victories too. She told Mrs. Wilson about growing up with a mother who worked 3 jobs, about being the first in her family to go to college, about the patients who taught her something new every day. Mrs. Wilson listened with her eyes, offering comfort with a gentle gaze or celebration with brightened expressions. Sometimes they didn't need words at all. Rose could tell by the slightest change in Mrs. Wilson's breathing if she was uncomfortable. Mrs. Wilson could communicate her needs with just a look. A glance at the window meant she wanted fresh air. A lingering gaze at the family photo meant she missed her grandchildren. One rainy afternoon, while thunder rumbled outside, Rose noticed Mrs. Wilson seemed anxious. Without saying a word, she pulled up a chair and started describing the rain in detail. How it made the leaves dance. How it brought out the earthy smell of the garden. How it made everything feel fresh and new. Slowly, Mrs. Wilson's anxiety melted away. Their connection went beyond the usual caregiving duties. When Rose's nephew took his first steps, Mrs. Wilson was the first person she told the next morning. When Mrs. Wilson's granddaughter won a school award, her eyes sought out Rose's to share in the joy. They celebrated each other's victories and supported each other through difficult days. "You know what's funny?" Rose said one evening while preparing Mrs. Wilson for bed. "Some people think communication is all about talking. But we've learned it's about so much more than that, haven't we?" Mrs. Wilson blinked once, and her eyes crinkled in that special way that Rose had come to recognize as her truest smile. As another day drew to a close, Rose realized that sometimes the strongest bonds are formed in silence, in the spaces between words where understanding grows like flowers reaching for the sun. Nobody expected the winter storm to hit so hard. The weathermen called it the worst in 30 years, with 3 feet of snow expected overnight. Rose watched the news with growing concern, knowing Mrs. Wilson needed her specialized care. No matter what, she had to find a way to get there. That morning, Rose woke up before dawn to find her car buried under snow. The streets hadn't been plowed, and her usual 15-minute drive was impossible. But Rose wasn't about to let Mrs. Wilson down. She put on her warmest coat, packed her medical supplies in a backpack, and started walking. The wind cut through her layers like ice, and the snow reached above her knees in places. Each step was a struggle, but Rose kept thinking about Mrs. Wilson, who needed her medication and care. She thought about their special language of blinks and glances, and how worried Mrs. Wilson would be if she didn't show up. 3 miles felt like 30 in those conditions. By the time Rose reached the house, her legs were numb, and her fingers felt frozen. Mrs. Chen opened the door, her eyes wide with disbelief. "You walked all this way?" she gasped, quickly pulling Rose inside. "We were just about to call and tell you not to come." But Rose simply stamped the snow off her boots and headed straight to Mrs. Wilson's room. One look at Mrs. Wilson's face told her everything. The relief, the gratitude, the worry. "Don't you fret," Rose said, warming her hands before starting their morning routine. "A little snow wasn't going to keep me away." That was just the beginning. The storm lasted 3 days, trapping everyone inside. The other caregivers couldn't make it, and even Mrs. Chen got stuck at her own home across town. Without hesitation, Rose stayed, sleeping on the floor beside Mrs. Wilson's bed. She wanted to be close in case anything happened during the night. During those 3 days, their bond grew even stronger. Rose kept their routine as normal as possible. Morning care, medications, gentle exercises to prevent muscle stiffness. But there was something special about being snowed in together, like the rest of the world had disappeared. "My grandmother used to say that hard times show us who people really are," Rose told Mrs. Wilson while giving her a sponge bath. "Like how a storm shows us which trees have the strongest roots." Mrs. Wilson's eyes glistened with understanding. They passed the time-sharing stories through their unique communication system. Rose would point to photos on the wall, and Mrs. Wilson would blink out tales about each one. They developed new signals too. 3 rapid blinks became their way of saying thank you, and a slow blink to the left meant tell me more. At night, when the wind howled outside and the house creaked with cold, Rose would sing softly. Old hymns her mother taught her, gentle lullabies that seemed to calm them both. Sometimes she'd catch Mrs. Wilson watching her with eyes full of motherly concern, worried about Rose sleeping on the floor. On the 3rd night, the power went out for a few hours. Rose immediately covered Mrs. Wilson with extra blankets and held her hand in the darkness. She described the snow falling outside the window, how it glowed even in the dark, how peaceful the world looked under its white blanket. Mrs. Wilson's hand might have been paralyzed, but Rose could feel the warmth of their connection. When the roads finally cleared and Mrs. Chen could return, she found them both safe and sound. Mrs. Wilson was actually doing better than ever, despite the challenging conditions. The trust and bond between them had grown stronger than anyone could have imagined. That evening, as Rose finally prepared to head home, Mrs. Wilson's eyes spoke volumes. She blinked 3 times rapidly, their special thank you. But this time, her eyes held something more. Pride, love, a deep appreciation that went beyond words. "You don't need to thank me," Rose said softly, adjusting Mrs. Wilson's blanket one last time. "This is what family does for each other." And in that moment, they both knew it was true. Sometimes the worst storms bring out the best in people, and sometimes they bring people together in ways that no sunny day ever could. After the winter storm, everything changed. The way Mrs. Wilson's children looked at Rose was different now. It wasn't just about her walking 3 miles in the snow. It was about how she had stayed, how she had put their mother first, how she had turned a crisis into comfort. One morning, Mrs. Wilson's oldest daughter brought coffee for Rose. "I got it just how you like it. 2 sugars, no cream," she said, placing it next to Rose while she was doing her morning routine. It was a small gesture, but it meant everything. She had been paying attention, learning about Rose just as Rose had learned about their family. The grandchildren started calling Rose Auntie, running to her with their school artwork and stories. They didn't see a caregiver anymore, they saw family. Even the youngest one, just 5 years old, had learned to read his grandmother's blinks and eye movements thanks to Rose's patient teaching. "Look, Grandma's saying she loves it," the little one would exclaim, holding up his crayon drawings. Rose would smile, remembering how far they'd come from those first uncertain days when the family barely made eye contact with her. During family gatherings, which used to feel awkward for Rose, she was now pulled right into the center. "Rose, you have to try this casserole." Mrs. Chen would insist. It's Mom's recipe. She blinked out the instructions for me last week. The fact that Mrs. Wilson had shared her secret family recipe through their special communication system touched Rose deeply. One afternoon, while Rose was helping Mrs. Wilson with her physical therapy exercises, Mrs. Chen walked in with a photo album she found in the attic. Inside were pictures from the 1960s. Mrs. Wilson standing proud in front of her integrated classroom, holding hands with children of all backgrounds. Mom never talked much about those days, Mrs. Chen said softly, watching Rose gently move her mother's arms to prevent stiffness. She was one of the first principals to welcome everyone, no matter what they looked like. She got a lot of angry letters back then. Mrs. Wilson's eyes filled with tears, and Rose paused the exercises. Through their special blinking system, Mrs. Wilson began to share more. She told them about the challenges she faced, the parents who pulled their children out of school, and the ones who stood by her side. You were changing lives back then, Rose said gently, just like you're changing lives now. Mrs. Wilson blinked rapidly, their signal for strong emotion. Her daughter watched this exchange with wonder, finally understanding the deep connection between these two women. The transformation in the family was complete when Mrs. Chen invited Rose to their Sunday dinners. Mom lights up when you're here, she explained. And honestly, so do we. Rose brought her famous sweet potato pie, made from her grandmother's recipe, and soon it became a regular request at family gatherings. Even the medical staff who came for checkups noticed the difference. I've never seen such a strong support system, one nurse commented, watching how seamlessly Rose worked with the family, how they all understood Mrs. Wilson's needs without words. The most touching moment came during Mrs. Wilson's birthday celebration. The family had planned a small gathering, but what made it special was how they included Rose in every aspect. They had a chair saved for her next to Mrs. Wilson, and when it came time to cut the cake, they insisted she help Mrs. Wilson's granddaughter blow out the candles. "Make a wish, Mom," Mrs. Chen said, and everyone watched as Mrs. Wilson's eyes moved to Rose, then back to her family, then back to Rose again. The message was clear. Her wish had already come true. Her family had grown in the most unexpected and beautiful way. Late that evening, as Rose was preparing to leave, Mrs. Wilson's youngest grandchild tugged at her sleeve. "Auntie Rose," he whispered, "Grandma told me with her eyes that you're her angel." Rose felt tears welling up as she looked at Mrs. Wilson, who blinked once, yes, with eyes full of love. Sometimes, Rose thought as she drove home that night, families aren't just made by blood. They're made by love, by understanding, by choosing to see past differences to the heart that beats the same in all of us. One rainy afternoon, while cleaning Mrs. Wilson's room, Rose found an old leather-bound journal tucked away in the bottom drawer of the bedside table. Mrs. Wilson's eyes lit up when she saw it, and through their special blinking system, she gave Rose permission to read it. The journal's pages were yellowed with age, filled with neat handwriting that told a story Rose never expected. Page after page revealed Mrs. Wilson's thoughts from decades ago, when she was a young principal facing the challenges of running one of the first integrated schools in the area. Dear Diary, one entry from 1963 read, "Today I stood my ground. When the school board threatened to fire me for welcoming all children, regardless of their color, I reminded them that education is a right, not a privilege. My own parents would be horrified by my actions, but I can't let their prejudices control my conscience anymore." Rose looked up at Mrs. Wilson, whose eyes were glistening with tears. Through their blinking communication, Mrs. Wilson urged her to continue reading. The journal entries painted a picture of a woman who had fought her own battles against discrimination, often standing alone against her family's deep-rooted prejudices. Another entry described a Christmas dinner where Mrs. Wilson's parents refused to attend because she had invited her black students and their families to the school holiday celebration. "Sometimes doing what's right means walking a lonely path," she had written. But tonight, seeing those children's smiles made every criticism worth it. As Rose read, Mrs. Chen walked in quietly and sat down to listen. Her mother had never shared these stories before. The journal revealed how Mrs. Wilson had secretly attended civil rights rallies, how she had faced threatening phone calls for standing up for equality, and how she had worked to change minds one person at a time. "Mom," Mrs. Chen whispered, "I had no idea." Mrs. Wilson's eyes moved between her daughter and Rose, telling a story of regret and hope. Through their blinking system, she expressed how she wished she had shared these stories sooner, how she had carried the weight of her family's prejudices even while fighting against them. One particular entry caught Rose's attention. "Today, my father refused to speak to me at Mother's funeral." The words trembled on the page. "He said I betrayed everything they taught me. But they taught me love and fairness too, even if they didn't apply those lessons equally. I hope someday they'll understand that I'm actually living the values they gave me, just taking them further than they ever dared." Rose read about how Mrs. Wilson had started a scholarship program for underprivileged students, using her own salary to help children attend college. She read about the quiet ways Mrs. Wilson had worked to bring people together, hosting dinners where families from different backgrounds could find common ground. "I might never change my parents' minds," one of the final entries read, "but I can change the future. Every child who learns to see beyond color, every parent who opens their heart, every small step forward, it all matters. Change happens one heart at a time." Mrs. Wilson's eyes were fixed on Rose as she finished reading. Through their special communication, she shared how finding Rose as her caregiver felt like life coming full circle, a chance to experience the very acceptance she had fought so hard to create for others. That evening, Mrs. Chen brought up old photo albums, and together they looked at pictures from those early school days. There was Mrs. Wilson, standing proud despite the challenges, creating a better world one small action at a time. "You were fighting for people like me before you ever knew me," Rose said softly, holding Mrs. Wilson's hand. "And now here we are, family in all the ways that matter." Mrs. Wilson blinked once. Yes, her eyes full of peace and completion. As the sun set, casting long shadows through the window, Rose realized that sometimes the most important stories are hidden in quiet places, waiting to remind us that change is possible, that hearts can grow, and that love always finds a way to bridge the gaps between us. After 5 years of caring for Mrs. Wilson, Rose noticed subtle changes in her patient's condition. The strong spirit was still there in those expressive eyes, but Mrs. Wilson's body was growing weaker. The doctors had warned them this might happen, but knowing something and facing it are two different things. One quiet morning, while Rose was adjusting Mrs. Wilson's pillows, she noticed something different about her breathing. She'd learned every sound, every subtle change in Mrs. Wilson's face over the years, and something wasn't right. She called the doctor immediately, her heart pounding, but her voice steady. "I'm right here," Rose whispered, holding Mrs. Wilson's hand as they waited. "I'm not going anywhere." Mrs. Wilson blinked once, their special way of saying yes, but her eyes held something more urgent. She kept glancing toward the computer setup they used for communication. The eye-tracking device had been Mrs. Chen's idea a few months back. It allowed Mrs. Wilson to spell out words by looking at letters on a screen. They didn't use it often. Their blink-based communication usually worked just fine. But today, Mrs. Wilson was insistent. "Do you want to tell me something?" Rose asked gently. One blink. Yes. Rose turned on the device and watched as Mrs. Wilson's eyes carefully picked out each letter. It was slow work, but Rose had learned patience long ago. Whatever Mrs. Wilson needed to say, she would wait for every word. The message began to take shape. "My dear Rose." There was a pause as Mrs. Wilson gathered her strength. Rose watched, her heart full of love and concern, as more words appeared on the screen. "I've made changes to my will," the message continued. "Don't argue, just listen." Rose felt tears welling up, but she stayed quiet, honoring Mrs. Wilson's wishes. The message went on, each word chosen with careful purpose. You showed me what real caring means. Not just medical care, but heart care. You helped me face my own past prejudices. You taught my family what love really looks like. I want you to have the means to help others the way you helped me." Mrs. Wilson paused, gathering strength before continuing. "I'm leaving you funds to build your care center. The one you told me about on all those quiet nights. A place where everyone is welcome, where dignity and love come first." Rose couldn't hold back her tears anymore. "Mrs. Wilson, I can't." But a stern look from those familiar eyes stopped her. There was more to the message. "You have a gift, Rose. Not just your medical skills, but your heart. You see people, really see them. You helped my family learn to really see too. This is my way of making sure that gift keeps giving." Just then, Mrs. Chen arrived with the doctor. Rose tried to step back, but Mrs. Wilson's eyes held her in place. One more message appeared on the screen. "You're more than my caregiver. You're my family. My legacy is your dream now." The doctor's examination confirmed what they'd feared. Mrs. Wilson's condition was deteriorating. But even as he explained the situation, Mrs. Wilson's eyes never left Rose's face. They had their own conversation in silence, through looks and blinks that spoke louder than words. That evening, the whole family gathered in Mrs. Wilson's room. Rose watched as Mrs. Chen read her mother's message about the will. There were tears, but also smiles. Everyone understood. This was exactly like the Mrs. Wilson they'd read about in her journal, still fighting for what was right, still working to make the world a little better. "Mom wants her legacy to live on through you," Mrs. Chen told Rose, hugging her tight. "And so do we." As night fell, Rose sat by Mrs. Wilson's bed, just like she had during that winter storm years ago. The room was quiet except for the soft peeping of monitors. Mrs. Wilson's eyes found hers, and they shared one more message through their special language of blinks and gazes. In that moment, Rose understood that some gifts come wrapped in unexpected packages. Sometimes they come in the form of challenges that turn into blessings or strangers who become family. And sometimes they come in the form of a note that changes everything. Not because of what it promises, but because of the love it represents. 2 years after Mrs. Wilson's peaceful passing, a new building stood proud on the east side of town. Its windows gleamed in the morning sun, and flowers bloomed in gardens designed to be accessible to wheelchairs. A sign above the entrance read, "The Wilson Memorial Care Center, where every heart finds home." Rose stood at the entrance, her hand trembling slightly as she held the scissors for the ribbon-cutting ceremony. The crowd gathered before her wasn't just made up of officials and reporters, it was filled with familiar faces. Mrs. Chen and her whole family were there, along with many of Mrs. Wilson's former students, now gray-haired themselves. "My mother believed in breaking down barriers," Mrs. Chen said in her opening speech, her voice strong with emotion. "She did it as a principal decades ago, and she's still doing it today through this care center and through Rose, who showed us what real care looks like." The center was everything Rose had dreamed of and more. The walls were painted in warm, cheerful colors, and photographs from Mrs. Wilson's teaching days hung in the main hallway. A reminder of her legacy of inclusion and love. Each room was designed to make patients and families feel at home, not in a medical facility. As Rose walked through the building, memories flooded back. She remembered all those nights talking to Mrs. Wilson about this dream, describing every detail while giving her evening care. Mrs. Wilson would blink her encouragement, her eyes shining with belief in Rose's vision. The center employed caregivers from all backgrounds, many of whom Rose had personally trained. She made sure they all learned the importance of communication beyond words, how to read eyes, expressions, and the subtle languages that develop between caregivers and patients. "This room is special," Rose explained to visitors, showing them a cozy space filled with books and comfortable chairs. "It's our communication center, where we teach families different ways to connect with their loved ones who can't speak." Mrs. Wilson taught me that love doesn't need words to be heard. In another room, a young caregiver was teaching a family the same blinking communication system that Rose and Mrs. Wilson had used. Rose paused in the doorway, her heart full. This was exactly what Mrs. Wilson had wanted, her legacy living on, touching more lives, creating more connections. The center had become known for its scholarship program, too, helping promising students become certified caregivers. Everyone deserves a chance to make a difference, Rose would say during interviews, echoing words from Mrs. Wilson's old journal. That afternoon, as the celebration continued, Rose slipped away to a quiet corner where a portrait of Mrs. Wilson hung. In it, she was smiling that warm smile Rose remembered so well, the one that reached all the way to her eyes. Beside it was a plaque with words from her journal. Change happens one heart at a time. Mrs. Chen found her there, standing hand in hand with her children. Mom would be so proud, she said softly. Look at all the lives you're touching, all the barriers you're breaking, just like she did. The center had already helped hundreds of families, creating a community where differences didn't matter, where care came from the heart. Rose had made sure that every caregiver understood that their job wasn't just about medical tasks. It was about seeing the person behind the patient, about building bridges between hearts. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow through the windows, Rose gathered everyone in the main hall. Mrs. Wilson taught me that care is a language all its own, she said, her voice steady and sure. It speaks through gentle hands, through patient hearts, through eyes that see beyond the surface. This center is more than a building. It's a promise to keep that language alive. Looking out at the faces before her, Rose saw everything she and Mrs. Wilson had worked for coming to life. There were families finding hope, caregivers finding purpose, and most importantly, people from all walks of life coming together with open hearts. Every person who walks through these doors, Rose concluded, becomes part of Mrs. Wilson's legacy. Every act of kindness, every moment of understanding, every bridge built between hearts, that's her dream living on. And in that way, she's still here, still teaching us, still bringing out the best in all of us. As evening fell, the center glowed like a beacon of hope in the growing darkness. Rose stood at the window, watching families leave with lighter hearts and brighter smiles. She could almost feel Mrs. Wilson's presence, could almost see her proud smile, could almost hear her saying, through their special language of love and understanding, "Well done."